Imagine laughing at a legend's age, thinking you can easily outsmart him, only to find out that the real power isn't in youth or arrogance, but in the quiet wisdom of experience. That's exactly what happened when one young man mocked Clint Eastwood, only to instantly regret it when he realized just how wrong he was. Stick around to find out how Clint's silent strength taught him a lesson that would change his life forever. Before we dive into the story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. It was a quiet afternoon at the local cafe, a familiar setting where regulars gathered like clockwork to sip coffee and share stories. The hum of low conversations and the clink of ceramic mugs filled the air, creating a comfortable buzz. It was just another day, another routine, until he spoke. Among the crowd sat Jason, a man in his early 30s, whose youthful arrogance practically radiated from him. He sat with a kind of self-assuredness that comes from thinking you have all the answers, an attitude that can only come from being young and confident, perhaps even a bit too confident. "So let's be real," Jason began, his voice carrying across the table. His words were like a challenge, his tone firm and almost brash, as if he were the authority on everything. "Clint Eastwood these days? He's just an old guy. Hell, I bet I could take him on in any challenge. What's he gonna do, squint at me and give me that make my day look? Please." The table erupted in scattered laughter, some of it awkward, others more genuine. But the laughter, though loud, held a hint of uncertainty, as if the others weren't entirely sure if it was safe to laugh at Clint Eastwood, a name that was both iconic and revered. The older members of the group shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to respond. But Jason wasn't concerned with their reactions. He leaned back in his chair, his arms folding across his chest in a way that suggested he felt secure, untouchable, as though his youthful energy and bravado could outshine the shadows of the past. His grin grew wider, self-satisfied, as he reveled in the attention he'd garnered. "Old age doesn't mean anything," he continued, almost to himself, but loud enough for the others to hear. "He's just a relic of the past. Bet he can barely move anymore." The words slipped out casually, as if it were just another observation, but they struck a nerve with the older folks at the table. A subtle shift in energy occurred, a shift that was so quiet it almost went unnoticed. The smiles from the older men and women seemed to fade slightly, and the laughter stopped. Some exchanged quick glances, the kind of glance that spoke volumes without saying a word. It was a look of caution, perhaps a warning, something Jason couldn't, or wouldn't, pick up on. But he didn't care. In his mind, the older generation had their time, and now it was his turn. The world was changing, and he was the future. Clint Eastwood, with his silver hair and wrinkles, was a memory, a thing of the past. Jason felt that familiar, almost intoxicating sense of invincibility that youth often brings, and in that moment, Clint's legacy seemed irrelevant. Jason's future, his moment, was now. The older patrons of the cafe watched him, their eyes filled with silent understanding, but Jason was too absorbed in his own words to notice. The mockery he'd so carelessly made of Clint's age seemed to hang in the air, but to Jason, it was just the truth. He thought he was in control, thinking he could say whatever he wanted without consequence. What he didn't realize was that with every word he spoke, he was inching closer to a reality he hadn't prepared for. The world, it seemed, had a way of humbling those who thought they knew everything. And Clint Eastwood, a man who had lived through decades of challenges, wasn't a man to be dismissed so easily. Jason didn't know it yet, but his laughter was about to come back to haunt him. The conversation had started to drift, the awkwardness of Jason's bold declaration hanging in the air like a low cloud. People were still chuckling nervously, glancing around as if waiting for someone to say something to break the tension. It was clear to everyone in the cafe, except Jason, that there was an unspoken respect for Clint Eastwood, even among the older generation in the room. They were watching Jason, each one of them silently reminding themselves of the unspoken rule: don't mess with legends. But Jason, oblivious to the weight of his words, didn't care. He leaned forward, propped his elbows on the table, and continued, still on a roll. He talked about how things were changing, how the world was evolving, how he, as the young and the bold, was leading the charge into a future that left the past behind. As if on cue, the door to the cafe swung open with a creak, and there was a brief but noticeable shift in the room. The energy seemed to change, the kind of shift you feel before someone important enters. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't an announcement. But it was Clint. Clint Eastwood, dressed in a weathered jacket and jeans, walked in slowly but steadily. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to be. His presence filled the space around him, even though he wasn't trying to. The wrinkles on his face told stories of years lived, of battles fought, both on screen and off. The younger man didn't immediately notice. Jason, wrapped up in his own voice, kept on talking, even as the cafe patrons turned their heads toward Clint. It was subtle at first, the quiet reverence that crept into the room as everyone's attention shifted toward the man who had lived 1,000 lifetimes in his films. To Jason, it was just another person walking in. But Clint, with a deliberate calmness, made his way to the counter, ordering his coffee as if he were just like anyone else. Yet there was something undeniably commanding about the way he stood. The way he moved, slow, sure, but still strong, was the very definition of quiet power. Jason, still talking, finally caught sight of Clint as he stood up from his seat and walked over to the counter. There was a flicker of recognition in Jason's eyes as he watched Clint, but it wasn't enough to make him rethink his words. He couldn't help himself. The bravado was still there, the youthful arrogance he'd carried with him for so long. "Hey, look," Jason said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The man himself, Clint Eastwood in the flesh. You think he's still got what it takes? I mean, come on. He's what, in his 80s now?" Jason didn't wait for anyone to respond. He kept going, half joking, half mocking. "I bet he's just looking for a seat, not a fight. This guy's probably past his prime. All he's got now is a few good one-liners left." Jason's words were loud, but Clint didn't flinch. He didn't react. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, waiting for his coffee, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. His silence only deepened the tension in the air. The crowd felt it too. The room seemed to hold its breath. The older members of the cafe looked at Jason, some with concerned expressions, others with a quiet understanding. They all knew that Clint was someone who didn't need to prove anything. He had earned his respect, and it was written all over him. Jason, on the other hand, was still wrapped in his youthful cockiness, unaware of the consequences of his words. He was so sure of himself, so certain that the world he knew was the only world that mattered, that he couldn't see the lesson that was about to unfold before him. As Clint received his coffee and slowly turned to head toward an empty table, he caught Jason's eye. For a brief moment, their gazes met, Jason with his arrogant smirk, Clint with his unwavering calmness. And in that fleeting moment, something passed between them. It wasn't a challenge. Not yet. It was something deeper, a reminder to Jason that some things, some people, were beyond the reach of his mockery. Clint didn't need to say a word. His silence said everything. Jason, still feeling the rush of his earlier words, didn't back down. He turned away, his eyes scanning the room for anyone who would back him up. But the crowd was no longer laughing. The energy had shifted. Clint Eastwood hadn't uttered a single word, and yet, somehow, the room was quieter, more respectful. Jason hadn't realized it yet, but he had already made a dangerous misstep. He had underestimated the strength that came with experience, and he was about to learn the hard way. Jason couldn't let it go. The silence, the way Clint Eastwood had simply turned his back and walked away without so much as a glance toward him, nod at him. There was a momentary doubt that flickered in Jason's mind, but he quickly brushed it off. In his mind, Clint's lack of reaction was just that, lack of reaction. Nothing more. The old man had probably heard the jokes 1,000 times before, and didn't have the energy to care anymore. Jason, however, was brimming with energy, and the quiet tension in the room only seemed to fuel his fire. He was the future. He was the one who was supposed to lead the charge. Clint, on the other hand, was a relic, someone who had seen his best days long ago. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Not like this. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over to Clint's table with a smirk on his face, one that was more a challenge than a smile. "Hey, Clint." Jason's voice rang out across the cafe, cutting through the low murmur of conversations. "How about a challenge? You and me. A little test of skill, maybe? See if the old man's still got anything left in the tank." Jason stood there, arms folded, his chest puffed out, waiting for Clint to respond. His tone was mocking, yet there was something else there, a deep sense of insecurity masked by bravado. It was clear to everyone around them that Jason wasn't trying to prove anything to Clint. He was trying to prove it to himself. Clint didn't respond immediately. He simply looked up at Jason with a gaze that was steady, unflinching. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The old man's presence was enough. Jason, undeterred by the silence, pressed on. "Come on, Clint. What's the worst you could do? You're just a guy in a cowboy hat with a couple of good lines left. Bet I could run circles around you." He laughed, the sound sharp and self-assured. Around them, the room grew quieter. The older folks in the cafe exchanged glances, a knowing look passing between them. They could see what was happening. They knew Clint didn't need to prove himself to anyone. And yet, something about Jason's challenge made it clear that Clint wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. Jason, sensing the crowd's hesitation, grew more confident. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Clint could hear. "You don't have to take me seriously, but I'm serious. Let's see if you've still got what it takes. Or maybe you're just a washed-up old actor who's forgotten how to live." The words stung, more than Jason realized. He thought he was being clever, but what he didn't know was that he had just crossed a line. It wasn't just a matter of mocking Clint's age. It was a personal attack, aimed directly at the heart of everything Clint had worked for. For a moment, there was complete silence. No one moved. Not a sound. The tension in the air thickened, and it was as if the cafe itself held its breath, waiting for Clint's reaction. Then, slowly, Clint stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply stood, his movements deliberate and measured, like someone who had lived through enough to know that some things didn't need to be said. Jason, still standing at the edge of Clint's table, waited for something, anything, that would give him the upper hand. But Clint said nothing. Instead, Clint walked toward the door, his steps steady, almost calculated. Jason stood there, a little unsure now, watching Clint with a mixture of defiance and anticipation. What was Clint going to do? Was he going to back down? Was he going to make Jason look like a fool? Clint reached the door, opened it, and then turned back to face Jason. "Let's take this outside," Clint said quietly, his voice low but firm. No theatrics. No grand speech. Just simple words, but they were loaded with unspoken meaning. He didn't need to elaborate. It was a challenge, but a challenge that Jason wasn't fully prepared for. The cafe patrons were silent. There were no cheers, no applause, just the quiet hum of the world going on around them. The moment felt surreal, like it was happening in slow motion, and Jason was suddenly aware of how out of place he was. But there was no backing down now. Jason's smirk remained, though it had lost some of its edge. He couldn't let Clint see that doubt, that small crack in his facade. He followed Clint out the door, his heart beating just a little faster, the realization that he might have bitten off more than he could chew starting to settle in. The door swung shut behind them, and the world outside was waiting for what would happen next. Outside, the air was thick with anticipation. The sounds of the city filled the space around them, car horns honking in the distance, the chatter of pedestrians walking by, but it felt as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Clint stood still, his gaze steady and calm, while Jason approached with the fire of youthful arrogance still burning within him. The cafe door swung shut behind them, and Jason couldn't help but feel a slight rush of adrenaline. This was it. He was about to show Clint who was in charge. In his mind, he pictured himself easily outwitting the old man, perhaps even humbling him with a few choice moves. He couldn't let Clint, or anyone, think he could be dismissed so easily. Jason cleared his throat, still trying to hold on to his cocky composure. "So," he said with a nervous chuckle, "what do you want to do, Clint? A race? Or maybe a good old-fashioned arm wrestling match?" Clint didn't respond immediately. He merely took a few slow steps toward his car, his movements deliberate but controlled. Jason, still uncertain but refusing to show it, followed behind, his confidence slowly beginning to crack under the weight of the unknown. Clint reached his car, a nondescript, older vehicle that blended in with the rest of the world's clutter. It was a stark contrast to the iconic figure Clint had once been in the spotlight. But the car, like Clint himself, carried a quiet strength. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Without saying a word, Clint opened the trunk of the car, revealing something that instantly made Jason pause. There, hidden under a few layers of old clothing, was a set of high-tech equipment, tools, weapons, gadgets that looked like they belonged in a much different world. Jason's gaze flickered from the tools back to Clint, unsure of what to make of it. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. His heart rate quickened as the reality of the situation started to sink in. Clint turned to face him, his expression still calm, but his eyes sharp. "You wanted a challenge, Jason," he said quietly. "Well, you've got one." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He hadn't expected this. Not in a million years. There was something about Clint Eastwood, the stillness in his posture, the quiet confidence that radiated from him, that now seemed like a trap. Jason's bravado had led him to believe that Clint was just a man who had been left behind by time. But in that moment, Jason realized he had grossly underestimated Clint's experience, his skill, and his ability to survive. Clint didn't need to demonstrate physical strength. He didn't need to prove himself in the way Jason expected. What he had was something far more dangerous: years of training, knowledge, and the ability to keep his cards close to his chest. Jason, for the first time, felt out of place. His words, once filled with cocky bravado, now tasted bitter. He had poked fun at Clint's age, but this moment, standing in front of the car, looking at tools that were far beyond his comprehension, showed Jason exactly how wrong he had been. "Clint, I didn't know," Jason muttered, his bravado crumbling. Clint didn't respond right away. He simply closed the trunk, his expression unreadable. There was no need for further explanation. Clint had already said everything with his actions. He had shown Jason the difference between being a celebrity on a screen and being a man who had lived a lifetime of challenges, of real survival. Jason had been playing a game he didn't understand, and Clint had just shown him how far out of his league he was. Clint's eyes met Jason's once again, and there was a quiet understanding there, as if Clint had known from the start how this would play out. With one last glance, Clint turned and began walking away, toward the street, as though the whole incident was already behind him. Jason stood frozen, the air thick with regret and humiliation. He had come out here looking for a fight, eager to prove something, but now he realized that Clint had already won. Without a single physical confrontation, Clint had proven that true strength wasn't about bravado or challenges. It was about wisdom, experience, and quiet confidence. Jason wanted to call out, to apologize, but the words were stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? Clint had already left him in the dust. Not with a punch or a show of force, but with a simple, silent gesture that revealed everything Jason needed to know. The street seemed emptier now. Jason felt smaller, his chest tight. He had been foolish. His arrogance had led him into a trap, and now, all he could do was stand there, watching as Clint disappeared into the distance. Jason stood there, motionless, as Clint Eastwood walked away. The silence around him felt suffocating. The weight of his words from earlier, the arrogance, the mocking tone, began to sink in, and with it came a wave of regret so heavy that Jason almost couldn't breathe. He had thought he was in control. He had thought that he was the one who could define the rules, that his youth and confidence would give him the upper hand. He had mocked Clint, ridiculed him, and made assumptions about him, about what he was capable of. But now, standing there, Jason realized just how foolish he had been. He looked at the spot where Clint had stood just moments ago, his eyes tracing the outline of the car that Clint had walked away from. The tools in the trunk, the quiet way Clint had carried himself, it all made sense now. Jason had underestimated Clint, not just as an individual, but as someone who had lived through things Jason could never imagine. Clint wasn't just some aging actor. He was someone who had lived a life filled with challenges, both in the spotlight and out of it. Jason's stomach churned. The brash words he had thrown out earlier, words meant to impress and assert his dominance, now felt like daggers in his own chest. How had he let his ego take over like that? How had he been so blind? He turned away, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The pride, the bravado, they seemed so insignificant now. The things he had said to Clint, about his age, his relevance, his ability, none of it mattered. In fact, it felt absurd to even think that way now. Jason tried to speak, to call out to Clint, but his voice caught in his throat. What could he say? "I'm sorry" seemed too little, too late. The words felt hollow, meaningless. He had crossed a line, and now he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own arrogance. He looked around at the people still lingering outside the cafe, some with sympathetic glances, others with quiet nods of understanding. They had seen the exchange. They knew exactly what had just happened. Jason could feel the weight of their stares, the realization that he had been caught in a moment of utter foolishness. The door to the cafe creaked open, and a few of the regulars stepped outside, their eyes avoiding his as they passed. The silence between them felt heavy. No one said a word. There was nothing left to say. Jason wasn't sure if they were pitying him or simply letting him experience the lesson on his own. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the ground. The world around him continued to move, the hum of the city a reminder that life didn't wait for anyone. But for Jason, it felt as if time had stopped. He was no longer the young man who thought he knew everything. He was just a man, humbled, broken, and realizing the depth of his mistake. The arrogance he had carried with him for so long now seemed like a mask. And beneath it, all he could feel was a profound sense of regret. Jason took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that had overtaken him. He knew he had to learn from this. He couldn't go back in time and undo what he had said to Clint. But he could change. He could become better. The weight of Clint's silent lesson, delivered without a single word, pressed down on him. It wasn't the challenge Jason had expected. It wasn't about strength or skill. It was about respect. Respect for age. Respect for experience. Respect for those who had lived through the things he could only imagine. Jason didn't know how long he stood there, but eventually he turned and walked back into the cafe. The room was quieter now, the earlier buzz of conversation replaced with an air of quiet reflection. He took a seat at his table, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He couldn't bring himself to look at them. They had all seen him in his most vulnerable state, caught in the web of his own ego, with no way out. But in that moment, Jason knew something had shifted. He wasn't the same person he had been when he walked into the cafe that afternoon. His arrogance had been shattered, replaced by a humility he hadn't expected. And though it pained him to admit it, he knew that Clint Eastwood had taught him something far more valuable than any challenge or contest ever could. Clint hadn't needed to say a word. He had simply been who he was, and in doing so had shown Jason the true measure of strength. The door to the cafe swung open, but Jason didn't look up. The world felt muted, almost distant, like the hum of the street outside had faded into the background. The cafe wasn't the same anymore. The familiar warmth, the chatter of conversations, it all felt foreign to him. Jason's thoughts swirled, chasing the quiet wisdom Clint had unknowingly imparted on him. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there, his hands resting on the table, unmoving, but when he finally did lift his gaze, the world seemed different. A few of the regulars who had witnessed the earlier exchange gave him the smallest of nods, acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. There was no laughter, no teasing. Just a subtle, knowing respect. Jason wasn't sure if they pitied him or if they saw something more. But in that moment, he realized that they didn't need to say anything. They already understood. The real lesson wasn't about who was stronger, faster, or more youthful. It was about the quiet strength that Clint had shown. The strength that came not from boasting or bravado, but from living a full life, a life that had weathered storms, endured hardship, and still stood tall in the face of arrogance and judgment. And that's when Jason knew. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a legend on screen. He was a legend off screen as well. What Clint had done wasn't simply to challenge him physically, or even to prove a point. He had lived through enough to know that some challenges weren't meant to be fought with fists or words. Some challenges were meant to be met with silence, with wisdom, and with the unwavering confidence that comes from truly understanding what it means to live. Jason stood up, slowly, his legs feeling heavier than they had before. He didn't feel the rush of victory, or the usual cocky swagger that came with getting what he wanted. Instead, he felt something else, something deeper. The sense of humility that had taken root in him after that brief exchange outside had transformed him. He wasn't sure what the next steps in his life would be, but he knew he couldn't keep living the way he had. He stepped outside, the cool air greeting him like an old friend. For a moment, he looked up at the sky, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He couldn't help but wonder if Clint had known what was coming when he walked into the cafe earlier that day. Did Clint know that Jason would challenge him? Did he know that Jason's arrogance needed to be crushed, not by force, but by a simple shift in perspective? Jason knew he'd never have the answers to those questions, but it didn't matter. The lesson had already been taught. And it wasn't one that could be learned from a textbook or in a classroom. It was a lesson that only experience could offer. And Clint had given it to him. As Jason walked down the sidewalk, he passed the same street corner where Clint had driven off earlier. The street was busy, as usual, cars honking, people chatting as they walked past. But Jason noticed something new. A sense of calm. A sense of peace. He felt like he was seeing the world through a different lens, one where judgment was no longer quick or rash, where respect for those who came before him held weight. And that's when it hit him. Clint Eastwood hadn't just taught him how to be humble. He had taught him how to appreciate the depth of those around him, regardless of their age. Clint had lived through so much, and had learned how to handle life's trials with grace and composure. That was the true strength Jason hadn't seen before. Quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to be loud or boastful. The kind that could walk away from a challenge, not because it couldn't face it, but because it knew there was nothing to prove. Jason smiled to himself, a soft, genuine smile. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew this. The next time he found himself ready to mock or underestimate someone, he would stop. He would think of Clint, how he had shown him that wisdom came from within, and that sometimes the most powerful people in the world didn't need to shout to be heard. Jason took a deep breath, feeling a sense of quiet pride in himself for the first time. He wasn't the arrogant young man who had walked into that cafe earlier. He was someone else now. Someone who had learned to see beyond surface-level judgments. Someone who had learned that real strength didn't come from making others feel small. It came from lifting them up. And as he continued walking down the street, Jason's heart was a little lighter. Because he knew deep down that Clint Eastwood's legacy wasn't just about the movies. It was about the lessons he had taught, without saying a word. The city around Jason buzzed with its usual energy as he continued down the street. But for the first time, he felt as though he was moving through it with a different sense of purpose. The usual noise and rush of everyday life no longer felt as important. The clutter, the distractions, he was no longer fazed by them. It was as if the world had slowed down for him, allowing him to process everything that had just happened. Jason's steps felt more measured, slower. He wasn't hurrying anymore. His mind was no longer clouded with youthful arrogance, and the lingering echoes of his challenge to Clint Eastwood were replaced by something deeper, an understanding. He thought back to the moment outside the cafe, when Clint had opened the trunk of his car, revealing tools that Jason could never have imagined. For a second, Jason had thought he was simply playing a game that was supposed to prove his superiority. But Clint had turned the game on its head, teaching him that some things couldn't be measured by physical tests or challenges. Some things, strength, experience, wisdom, could only be truly understood by living through them. Jason remembered the way Clint had simply walked away, the quiet authority in his every step. There had been no theatrics, no dramatic confrontation. Clint hadn't had to prove anything. It was a moment of sheer composure that cut through Jason's bravado and left him standing in silence. The lesson was clear now. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a movie star. He was a symbol of something greater, the quiet power that comes with age, the wisdom that comes from experience, and the strength that doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. Jason had mocked that strength, assuming it was gone, but Clint had shown him that true power doesn't fade with time. It becomes more refined, more controlled, more profound. Jason's thoughts shifted to his own life, to the decisions he had made and the way he had lived, constantly seeking validation, constantly trying to prove himself. He had been too focused on the wrong things: how to be seen, how to be recognized, how to stay ahead of the curve. But what Clint had taught him wasn't about staying ahead. It was about knowing when to step back, when to listen, and when to simply let the world unfold in its own time. It was about understanding that sometimes strength meant holding your ground and letting others see you for who you truly were, without needing to put on a show. Jason stopped at a street corner, watching as people passed by. He observed them now with a different eye, an eye that saw beyond their appearance, beyond their age or status. He saw them as individuals, as people who had lived lives of their own, full of stories and struggles, triumphs and failures. He realized how often he had been quick to judge, quick to dismiss, because he hadn't understood the value of what others had been through. But now, thanks to Clint, he was starting to see things differently. The small things, like a simple smile from a passerby, or a respectful nod from someone older, began to carry more weight. He found himself wanting to hear their stories, wanting to learn from them, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he had learned the value of experience. Jason looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the sun on his face. He wasn't sure where this new understanding would take him, but he was certain of one thing. He couldn't go back to who he had been. The arrogance, the need to prove himself, it was gone, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful sense of self. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, one that wasn't born from an attempt to prove anything to anyone. It was a smile of understanding. He had learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And he knew that the next time he encountered someone who seemed to be past their prime, or who he thought he could easily outsmart, he would remember Clint. Jason had learned that strength, wisdom, and respect didn't come from competing or putting others down. It came from understanding that everyone had a story, a lesson to offer, and that no one should ever be underestimated, no matter their age. With a newfound sense of humility, Jason took a deep breath and continued down the street. The world seemed a little more vibrant now, a little more full of possibilities. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he was excited for the journey ahead. And he knew that with each step, he would carry Clint's silent wisdom with him, guiding him in ways he never expected.